Wren had learned to be invisible. 8 years of scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and pressing linens in the royal palace had taught her that the best way to survive was to never be seen. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, head down, shoulders hunched, making herself as small and forgettable as possible. The other servants had names and faces and lives beyond the palace walls. Wren had nothing but calloused hands and a tiny room in the basement and the quiet certainty that this was all her existence would ever be. She had been 14 when her parents died in the border wars, leaving her orphaned and alone. The palace had taken her in out of obligation. Her father had been a soldier, after all, and the crown owed his memory something. But obligation didn't mean kindness. The head housekeeper, a sharp-tongued woman named Helene, had made it clear from the first day that Wren was charity, a burden, a mouth to feed that contributed nothing of value. So Wren had worked twice as hard as anyone else, swallowed every insult, and taught herself to disappear. It was easier that way, easier to fade into the background than to hope for something more. The morning everything changed started like any other. Wren rose before dawn, splashed cold water on her face, and pulled her brown hair back into a simple braid. She dressed in her gray servant's uniform, the same shapeless dress she had worn for years, and made her way up to the kitchens to collect the breakfast trays for the East Wing. The palace was quiet at this hour, the nobles still sleeping off the previous night's feast, and Wren savored the silence as she walked. She didn't know that the Alpha King had returned in the night. She didn't know that his diplomatic mission to the Southern Territories had ended 3 weeks early, or that he had ridden through the gates at midnight with a small company of guards. No one had thought to inform the servants. No one ever did. So when Wren rounded the corner with a tray of fresh bread and preserves, she walked directly into a wall of solid muscle. The tray went flying, bread scattered across the marble floor, and a jar of blackberry preserves shattered against the stone, splattering purple across Wren's dress and the polished boots of the man she had collided with. She dropped to her knees immediately, her heart hammering with terror, her hands scrambling to gather the ruined food. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, not daring to look up. "I didn't see you. I wasn't paying attention. Please forgive me. I'll clean this up immediately." "Stop!" The voice was deep and commanding, rough like gravel wrapped in silk. It resonated through her chest, and something inside Wren stirred, something that had been sleeping for so long she had forgotten it existed. Her wolf, the weak, quiet creature that had never fully awakened, that had always been too small and too faint to be of any use. It lifted its head now, ears pricked forward, and let out a sound Wren had never heard it make before. A whine of recognition. She froze. Her hands stopped moving, her breath caught in her throat, and slowly, against every instinct screaming at her to keep her head down, she looked up. The Alpha King stood before her. She had seen him from a distance over the years, a tall figure on the throne during formal ceremonies, a shadow passing through the halls surrounded by advisors and guards. But she had never been this close. Never close enough to see the sharp planes of his face, the dark hair that fell across his forehead, the storm-gray eyes that were currently fixed on her with an intensity that made her blood turn to ice and fire all at once. He was staring at her like he had never seen anything like her in his life, like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve, a question he didn't know how to ask. His nostrils flared, and she watched something shift behind his eyes. Shock, confusion, and then something deeper. Something that looked almost like hunger. "What is your name?" His voice was hoarse, strained, as if the words were being dragged out of him against his will. "Wren," she whispered. "I'm just a servant. I'm no one." The Alpha King, Theron, her mind supplied, though she had never dared to think of him by name, took a step closer. Then another. He towered over her, blocking out the morning light, and when he spoke again, the words shattered everything she thought she knew about her place in the world. "You are not no one." His hand reached down, fingers brushing her chin, tilting her face up toward his. You are my mate, and I have been searching for you for 8 long years. Ren's mind went blank. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. She was a servant, a nobody, an orphan who had spent nearly a decade scrubbing chamber pots and folding sheets. The Alpha King did not have mates like her. The Alpha King had noble ladies and foreign princesses throwing themselves at his feet, women with bloodlines and dowries and wolves strong enough to match his own. Not a skinny, forgettable girl with calloused hands and preserves splattered across her dress. I don't understand, she managed, her voice barely a whisper. There must be some mistake. Something flickered in Theron's storm-gray eyes. Pain, perhaps, or frustration. His jaw tightened and his hand fell away from her chin, though he didn't step back. He remained close enough that she could smell him. Pine and leather and something wild beneath it all. Something that made her dormant wolf keen with longing. There is no mistake. His voice was firm, certain. I felt it the moment you touched me. My wolf has been howling your name since you crashed into my chest. 8 years. I have searched every corner of this kingdom looking for you. 8 years I have attended balls and ceremonies and diplomatic functions, hoping to find the woman meant to stand beside me. A muscle ticked in his cheek. And you were here. The whole time you were right here and I never knew. Ren shook her head, panic clawing at her throat. This couldn't be happening. Her life was small and safe and predictable, and she didn't know how to exist outside its narrow walls. She didn't know how to be seen when she had spent so long learning to disappear. Please, she said, scrambling backward on the marble floor. Please, Your Majesty, I think you're confused. My wolf is weak. She barely speaks to me. I can't shift properly. I never have. And I'm not worthy of. Do not. The command in his voice stopped her cold. Theron crouched down, bringing himself to her level, and the intensity in his gaze made her forget how to breathe. Do not tell me what you are not worthy of. I have waited my entire adult life for you. I don't care if your wolf is weak. I don't care if you're a servant. The bond doesn't lie, Ren. You are mine, and I am yours, and nothing else matters. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Ren looked up to see Helene rounding the corner, her face already twisted into a scowl. The head housekeeper stopped short at the sight of the Alpha King crouched on the floor beside a servant covered in preserves, and her expression shifted from anger to confusion to something that looked almost like fear. Your Majesty. Helene dropped into a deep curtsy, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I apologize for this girl's clumsiness. She will be punished severely, I assure you. This sort of behavior is inexcusable. She will not be punished. Theron rose to his full height, and even Ren felt the weight of his authority pressing down on the corridor. She will be moved to the private quarters in the West Wing. She will be given new clothing, a personal attendant, and anything else she requires. She is no longer a servant in this palace. Helene's mouth fell open. Your Majesty, I don't understand. She is my mate. The words rang through the hallway like a proclamation. And you will treat her with the respect due to your future queen, or you will find yourself removed from your position. Is that clear? The color drained from Helene's face. Her eyes darted to Ren, and something ugly flashed in their depths. Jealousy, perhaps, or resentment. But she bowed her head and murmured her assent, and when she looked up again, her expression was carefully blank. Of course, Your Majesty. I will make the arrangements immediately. Theron turned back to Ren and offered her his hand. She stared at it, her heart pounding, her thoughts spinning in circles. 20 minutes ago, she had been invisible. 20 minutes ago, her biggest concern was whether the bread would still be warm when it reached the East Wing. Now the Alpha King was calling her his queen, and everything she had ever known was crumbling around her feet. She thought about refusing. She thought about running back to her tiny basement room and pretending this had never happened. But her wolf was howling inside her chest, straining toward the hand extended before her, and Wren realized with terrifying clarity that there was no going back. Her old life was over. Whatever came next, she would have to face it. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and impossibly gentle, and when he pulled her to her feet, she saw something soften in his storm-gray eyes. Relief, maybe, or gratitude, as if he had been afraid she would refuse, and her acceptance meant more than she could possibly understand. "Come," he said quietly. "We have much to discuss, and I suspect you need time to process what has happened." He led her away from the ruined breakfast, away from Helene's poisonous stare, away from everything she had ever known. And Wren followed, her hand trembling in his grip, wondering how a single collision had rewritten the entire story of her life. The West Wing was another world. Wren had cleaned these rooms 100 times, polishing the mahogany furniture and beating the dust from the velvet curtains, but she had never imagined living in them. Her new chambers were larger than the entire servants' quarters combined. A sitting room with a fireplace, a bedroom with a four-poster bed draped in silver silk, a private bathing room with a copper tub large enough to swim in. She stood in the middle of it all, still wearing her stained gray dress, and felt like an imposter waiting to be discovered. A knock at the door made her jump. A young woman entered, barely older than Wren herself, with copper curls and a spray of freckles across her nose. She carried an armful of dresses in rich fabrics, emerald green, deep burgundy, soft cream, and her smile was warm enough to ease some of the tension in Wren's shoulders. "I'm Della," the woman said, laying the dresses across the bed. "I've been assigned as your attendant. The king thought you might like a friendly face while you settle in." She tilted her head, studying Wren with open curiosity. "You're not what I expected, you know. The way Helene talked about you, I thought you'd be some kind of monster, but you just look scared." Wren let out a shaky laugh. "I am scared. I don't know how to do any of this. Yesterday I was scrubbing floors, and today I'm supposed to be queen? I don't even know which fork to use at dinner." Della's smile widened. "That's what I'm here for. We'll figure it out together." She held up one of the dresses, a simple but elegant gown in deep blue. "First things first. Let's get you out of those rags and into something that doesn't smell like blackberries." The next few days passed in a blur of lessons and fittings and meals served on silver platters. Della taught her how to walk without shuffling, how to hold her head high, how to address nobles without stammering. It was exhausting and overwhelming, and every night Wren collapsed into her enormous bed, feeling like she had run a marathon. But slowly, gradually, she began to feel less like a fraud. Theron visited her each evening. He came after the palace had quieted, when the corridors were empty and the servants had retired, and he sat with her by the fire while she practiced her etiquette or simply talked. He asked about her childhood, her parents, the years she had spent invisible in his own home. And he listened, really listened, with an attention that made her feel like every word she spoke mattered. On the fifth night, she finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been burning inside her since the moment they met. "Why did you never notice me before?" She stared into the flames, unable to look at him. 8 years I lived in this palace. 8 years I walked these halls. How could the bond not tell you I was here? The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. When Theron finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded like shame. "I don't know." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gray eyes fixed on the fire. "The healers say it shouldn't have been possible. A mate bond is supposed to be instant, undeniable. The moment we're in the same room, we should feel it." His hands clenched into fists. "But I felt nothing. For 8 years I walked past you without a second glance, and I don't understand why." Ren turned to look at him, and what she saw stole the breath from her lungs. The Alpha King, the most powerful man in 5 kingdoms, looked lost, broken, like he was carrying a weight too heavy for even his broad shoulders. "I've asked myself 1,000 times," he continued, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Was I too arrogant, too focused on my duties to see what was right in front of me? Or is there something wrong with me, something broken that kept me blind to my own mate?" He looked up at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her heart crack open. "You suffered alone for 8 years, Ren. 8 years of being invisible and mistreated, and I did nothing. I was supposed to protect you. I was supposed to find you, and I failed." She moved without thinking. One moment she was in her chair, and the next she was kneeling beside him, her hands reaching up to cup his face. His skin was warm beneath her palms, rough with stubble, and she felt him shudder at her touch. "You didn't fail," she said softly. "You didn't know. Neither of us knew. And maybe—" She hesitated, searching for words that felt too big for her mouth. "Maybe we weren't ready before. Maybe we had to become the people we are now before we could find each other." He stared at her, his gray eyes searching her face like she held answers he desperately needed. Then his hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his cheek. "How are you so kind?" he murmured. "After everything you've been through, how do you still have room for forgiveness?" Ren smiled, and for the first time since the collision in the corridor, it felt real. "Because holding on to bitterness never helped anyone. And because you're not the only one who's been lonely, Theron. I think maybe we both needed this. We both needed each other." Something shifted in his expression. Hope, fragile and fierce, blooming like a flower through cracked stone. He didn't kiss her. He didn't pull her into his arms. He simply sat there, holding her hand against his face, and let her see the man behind the crown. It was the most intimate moment of her life. The days that followed brought Ren something she had never expected to find in the palace: happiness. It crept up on her slowly, in small moments she didn't recognize until they had already passed. The way Theron's eyes lit up when she entered a room, the sound of Della's laughter as they practiced curtsies and ended up tangled on the floor, the taste of honey cakes at breakfast, warm and sweet, a luxury she had never been allowed when she was a servant. She was still learning, still stumbling, still waking in the night convinced that someone would burst through her door and tell her it had all been a mistake. But each morning the sun rose on the same impossible reality, and slowly she began to believe it might be real. Theron took her walking in the gardens on the 7th day. It was the first time they had been together in public since the announcement of their bond, and Ren felt the weight of every stare as they passed through the palace gates. Nobles whispered behind their hands, guards straightened and bowed, servants she had worked beside for years looked at her with expressions she couldn't read: surprise, resentment, or something that might have been hope. She kept her eyes forward and her hand tucked into the crook of Theron's arm and tried to pretend she belonged there. The gardens were beautiful in the late afternoon light, all golden sunshine and blooming roses and the sweet hum of bees drifting between the flowers. Theron led her to a stone bench beneath an ancient oak tree, its branches spreading wide enough to shelter them from curious eyes. They sat together in comfortable silence, and Ren tilted her face toward the dappled sunlight, letting the warmth seep into her skin. "I need to tell you something," Theron said quietly. "Something I've never told anyone." She opened her eyes and found him watching her with an expression caught between fear and determination. His jaw was tight, his hands clasped between his knees, and she recognized the posture of someone bracing for rejection. She had worn that same posture 1,000 times herself. "You can tell me anything," she said. He was silent for a long moment, gathering his words. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, as if each syllable cost him something. "My father was not a good man. He was cruel, paranoid, convinced that everyone around him was plotting his downfall. He trusted no one, not his advisors, not his guards, not even his own son. Theron's hands tightened, knuckles going white. When I was 12, he decided I was growing too strong, too popular with the people. He saw me as a threat, so he hired a witch to bind my wolf. Ren's breath caught. She stared at him, horror spreading through her chest like ice water. The binding was supposed to weaken me, he continued, make me easier to control. But it did more than that. It severed something inside me, some part of my wolf that was meant to recognize my mate. He looked at her then, and the anguish in his gray eyes made her want to weep. That's why I couldn't find you, Ren. That's why I walked past you for 8 years without feeling the bond. My father's cruelty blinded me to the one person I was meant to love. She didn't know what to say. Words felt too small for the enormity of what he had just revealed. His own father had mutilated his soul, had stolen years from both of them, had left Ren alone and invisible while Theron searched in vain for a mate he could never find. The injustice of it burned in her throat. The witch, she managed. Is she still alive? Can the binding be broken? My father had her killed after the ritual. He didn't want any witnesses. Theron's smile was bitter, broken. The binding weakened when he died. That's when I started to feel fragments of the bond, glimpses of something just out of reach. But it wasn't until I touched you that it shattered completely. You broke through walls that had stood for 18 years, Ren. You reached the part of me that everyone else had given up on. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She reached for him without thinking, taking his hands in hers, and felt the tremor that ran through his body at the contact. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for what he did to you. Don't. His voice cracked. Don't apologize for something that wasn't your fault. If anyone should apologize, it's me. You spent 8 years suffering because of a curse I didn't even know existed. You deserved so much better than what this palace gave you. Ren squeezed his hands, holding his gaze. Then let's stop apologizing. Let's stop looking backward at all the years we lost. She leaned closer, her heart pounding in her chest. We found each other now. That's what matters. That's the only thing that matters. Something in his expression crumbled. The walls he had built around himself, the careful control he wore like armor, all of it fell away, leaving only the man beneath. He lifted her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, soft and reverent, and full of a tenderness that made her soul ache. I don't deserve you, he murmured against her skin. Maybe not, she said, echoing words she didn't know she remembered. But you have me anyway. The formal announcement came 3 days later. Theron insisted on making it himself, standing before the assembled court in the great hall with Ren at his side. She wore a gown of deep silver that Della had helped her choose, her hair swept up in an elegant twist, and she had never felt more terrified in her entire life. Hundreds of eyes fixed on her, nobles, advisors, visiting dignitaries, and she could feel their judgment pressing against her skin like a physical weight. This woman is my fated mate, Theron declared, his voice ringing through the hall. She will be my queen, my partner, my equal in all things. Any disrespect shown to her will be treated as disrespect to the crown itself. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, the court began to bow. One by one, nobles lowered their heads in acknowledgement, and Ren stood frozen beside Theron, watching the impossible unfold before her eyes. These were the same people who had walked past her for 8 years without a second glance, the same people who had treated her like furniture, like nothing, and now they were bowing to her. She didn't see Helene standing at the back of the hall, her face twisted with barely concealed hatred. She didn't notice the way the head housekeeper's eyes tracked her every movement, cataloging every gesture, every whispered word. She was too busy trying not to faint. That night, Theron came to her chambers later than usual. The celebration had stretched on for hours, an endless parade of nobles offering their congratulations, with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Wren had smiled back until her face ached, had made polite conversation until her voice grew hoarse, and by the time she finally escaped to her rooms, she was shaking with exhaustion. She was standing by the window staring out at the moonlit gardens when she heard the knock. She knew it was him before she even opened the door. She could feel him now, a warm presence at the edge of her consciousness, as if the bond between them was growing stronger with each passing day. "I thought you might need rescuing," Theron said, stepping inside. He had shed his formal jacket somewhere along the way, and his shirt was loosened at the collar, revealing a sliver of tanned skin at his throat. "You looked like you were ready to bolt for the last 2 hours." Wren laughed, though it came out more like a sob. Was it that obvious? Only to me. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You were magnificent, Wren. You stood before the entire court, and you didn't waver. Not once." "I was terrified the entire time." "I know." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's being afraid and standing anyway. You are the bravest person I have ever met." She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. After so many years of craving the smallest kindness, his gentleness still overwhelmed her. Every brush of his fingers felt like a gift she didn't know how to accept. "Theron." His name was a whisper on her lips. "I need to tell you something." "Anything." She opened her eyes and looked up at him, at this man who had turned her entire world upside down. He was watching her with such tenderness, such patient hope, that the words spilled out before she could stop them. "I love you." Her voice trembled. "I know it's too soon. I know we've only had days together, really, and there's still so much we don't know about each other. But I love you. I think I started loving you that first night in the garden, when you let me see who you really are. And I don't know if that's the bond talking, or if it's just me, but I needed you to know. I needed dash dash." He kissed her. His mouth captured hers mid-sentence, swallowing the rest of her words, and Wren's mind went completely blank. His lips were warm and firm and impossibly soft, and he kissed her like she was something precious, something sacred, something he had been waiting his entire life to hold. Her hands came up to grip his shoulders, steadying herself as her knees threatened to buckle, and she felt his arm wrap around her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Theron pressed his forehead against hers and let out a shaky laugh. "I love you too," he murmured. "I have loved you since you knelt beside me and told me you were no one, because I looked at you, and all I could think was that I had never seen anyone more extraordinary in my life." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but for the first time in as long as she could remember, they were tears of joy. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on tight, burying her face in his shoulder, and let herself believe in something she had given up on years ago. A future, a family, a love that was entirely her own. She didn't know that the seeds of destruction had already been planted. She didn't know that Helene had spent the evening whispering poison into willing ears, spinning tales of an Omega who had bewitched the king with dark magic. She didn't know that by morning the first cracks would begin to show. But tonight, wrapped in Theron's arms, she was happy, and that was enough. The whispers started slowly, like poison seeping through cracks in stone. At first, Wren barely noticed them, a conversation that stopped when she entered a room, a servant who wouldn't meet her eyes, a noble who smiled too sweetly while saying nothing at all. She told herself she was imagining things. She told herself that suspicion was natural, that it would take time for the court to accept a servant as their future queen. But with each passing day, The whispers grew louder, and the looks grew colder, and the warmth she had begun to feel in the palace started to curdle into something sour. Della was the one who finally told her the truth. "They're saying you bewitched him." Her attendant's voice was quiet, her freckled face pale with worry. "That you used dark magic to create a false bond, to trick the king into believing you're his mate." She twisted her hands in her lap, unable to meet Wren's eyes. "Helene has been telling anyone who will listen. She says you were always strange, always lurking in shadows, always watching the king when you should have been working. She says you planned this for years." The words hit Wren like a blow to the chest. She sat down heavily on the edge of her bed, her mind spinning. Dark magic. A false bond. It was absurd. She could barely convince her own wolf to speak to her, let alone cast spells. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed it. What mattered was that the fragile acceptance she had begun to build was crumbling around her. "Who else knows?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Everyone." Della's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "The servants, the nobles, even some of the guards. Helene has been very thorough. She's been gathering allies for weeks, waiting for the right moment to strike." Wren pressed her hands to her face, fighting the urge to scream. 8 years she had survived in this palace by being invisible. 8 years she had kept her head down and her mouth shut, and her hopes locked away where no one could touch them. And now, the moment she dared to reach for something more, it was being ripped away from her. "I have to tell Theron," she said, standing abruptly. "He needs to know what's happening." "Wren, wait." But she was already moving, her silver slippers silent on the marble floor as she rushed through the corridors toward the throne room. Theron was supposed to be holding audiences today, hearing petitions from nobles and commoners alike. She would find him, tell him everything, and together they would put a stop to Helene's poisonous lies. She never made it to the throne room. The guards stopped her at the entrance, their faces hard and impassive. Wren recognized one of them, a young man named Corvin who had once smiled at her when she brought him his evening meal. He didn't smile now. He looked at her like she was something dangerous, something to be contained. "I'm sorry, my lady." The title dripped with barely concealed contempt. "The king is not receiving visitors at this time." "I'm not a visitor." Wren straightened her spine, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "I'm his mate. Let me through." "I have orders." Corvin's hand moved to the sword at his hip. "No one enters without authorization from the council. That includes you." The council. Wren's blood ran cold. The council was a group of 5 advisors who had served the crown for decades, men who had bent the knee to Theron's father and never fully accepted his son. If they had taken control of access to the king, something was very wrong. "What's happening?" she demanded. "Where is Theron? What have you done with him?" A new voice answered from behind her. "Nothing has been done with the king." Helene emerged from the shadows, her thin lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "He is simply indisposed. The council has raised concerns about his judgment, given recent events. They believe he may be under the influence of unnatural forces." Wren spun to face her, fury rising in her chest. "You did this. You spread those lies about me, and now you're using them to take power." "Lies?" Helene's smile widened. "I simply told the truth. You were a servant who suddenly caught the king's eye after 8 years of nothing. You have a weak wolf that can barely shift. And now, conveniently, the most powerful man in the kingdom believes you're his fated mate?" She laughed, a cold and brittle sound. "Even you must admit it sounds suspicious." "The bond is real." Wren's voice shook with anger. I could never." "The council will decide what's real." Helene stepped closer, lowering her voice so only Wren could hear. "And until they do, you will be confined to your chambers. For your own protection, of course. We wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to the king's beloved." Guards closed in around her, and Ren realized with dawning horror that she was trapped. She looked toward the throne room doors, willing them to open, willing Theron to appear and put an end to this madness. But the doors remained shut, and as the guards escorted her away, she felt the last of her hope crumbling to dust. Helene had won, and Ren had no idea how to fight back. 3 days passed in suffocating silence. Ren paced her chambers like a caged animal, wearing grooves into the carpet with her restless steps. The guards outside her door changed every 8 hours, but none of them would speak to her. No one would tell her what was happening with Theron, whether he was safe, whether he even knew she had been imprisoned. Della had vanished, reassigned, the guard said, though Ren suspected something far worse. The only person who came to see her was a silent servant who delivered meals she couldn't bring herself to eat. On the second night she tried to escape. She waited until the corridor fell quiet, then slipped a hairpin from her dresser and worked at the lock the way she had seen other servants do years ago. The mechanism clicked, and for one glorious moment she thought she was free. Then the door swung open to reveal 4 guards instead of 2, their hands on their swords, their eyes cold with warning. They had been expecting her to try. After that, they took her hairpins. They took her belt. They took anything that could be used as a tool or a weapon, and Ren was left with nothing but her thoughts and the growing certainty that she would die in this room. Her wolf had gone silent again. That was the worst part. The fragile connection she had begun to rebuild with her animal half had withered in the face of so much fear and despair, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't reach it. She was alone in every way that mattered, cut off from her mate, cut off from her wolf, cut off from everyone who had shown her kindness, just like before, just like always. Maybe Helene was right, a treacherous voice whispered in the back of her mind. Maybe this was never real. Maybe you wanted so badly to be loved that you convinced yourself the bond existed when it didn't. Maybe Theron looked at you and felt nothing, and you were too desperate to see the truth. She tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming, relentless as waves against a crumbling shore. 8 years of invisibility had left scars she couldn't see, wounds that had never healed properly. She had spent so long believing she was worthless that some part of her still couldn't accept anything else. And now, locked in a gilded cage with the whole court calling her a witch, that part of her was screaming louder than ever. On the third night, the door opened without warning. Ren scrambled to her feet, expecting guards or Helene or some new nightmare come to torment her. Instead, she found herself face to face with Theron. He looked terrible. His face was haggard, dark circles carved beneath his eyes, his clothes rumpled as if he hadn't changed them in days. But he was there, standing in her doorway, and the moment their eyes met, something inside her shattered. Ren! Her name was a ragged exhale on his lips. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. They locked me in the council chambers and told me you had fled. They said you had confessed to witchcraft and run away rather than face trial. I believed—" His voice broke. "For one terrible moment, I believed them." She pulled back, staring up at him with tear-blurred eyes. "You thought I left you? I should have known better." Shame twisted his features. "I should have trusted the bond, trusted you." But they had evidence. Forged letters, witnesses who claimed they saw you performing rituals. It all seemed so convincing, and I was so afraid that I had been blind again, that the curse had deceived me into loving someone who wasn't really my mate. The words cut deep, even though she understood. Hadn't she been thinking the same thing? Hadn't she been lying awake wondering if any of it was real? "How did you find out the truth?" she whispered. "Della." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. They reassigned her to the kitchens, but she never stopped digging. She found proof that Helene fabricated everything, the letters, the witnesses, all of it. Helene has been working with 2 council members who wanted to destabilize my rule. They plan to have you executed for witchcraft and declare me unfit to reign." Ren's knees buckled. Theron caught her, easing her down onto the edge of the bed, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "It's over now," he said. "Helene and her allies are in the dungeons awaiting trial. The council has been dissolved. You are safe, Ren. I swear to you, no one will ever lock you away again." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to fall into his arms and let the nightmare fade into memory. But the doubt still lingered, sharp-edged and cold, and she couldn't pretend they didn't exist. "You believed them," she said quietly. "Even for a moment. How do I know it won't happen again? How do I know the next time someone whispers lies about me, you won't? Because I choose you." He dropped to his knees before her, taking her hands in his. "Not just the bond, not just fate. I choose you, Ren. Every day for the rest of my life, I will choose you. And I will spend every one of those days proving that you can trust me." She looked at him kneeling at her feet, the Alpha King brought low by love and remorse, and felt the last of her walls begin to crumble. "Then prove it," she said, "starting now." The trial was held at dawn the next morning. Theron had wanted to wait, to give Ren time to recover, but she insisted. She needed to face Helene. She needed to look the woman in the eyes and show her that she had not been broken. 8 years of cruelty, weeks of whispered lies, 3 days of imprisonment. None of it had destroyed her, and Helene needed to know that. The great hall was packed with witnesses. Nobles crowded the galleries, servants lined the walls, and guards stood at every entrance with their hands on their swords. Ren walked beside Theron, her head held high, wearing a gown of deep crimson that Della had pressed into her hands that morning. "The color of strength," Della had said. "The color of survival." Helene stood in chains before the throne, flanked by the 2 council members who had conspired with her. Lord Aldrich was a thin, reedy man with watery eyes and a permanent sneer. Lord Bowen was his opposite, broad and barrel-chested, with a face like a clenched fist. They had served Theron's father for decades, had whispered in the old king's ear and encouraged his cruelty, and now they would finally answer for their crimes. "You stand accused of conspiracy against the crown," Theron announced, his voice ringing through the hall. "Of fabricating evidence, imprisoning an innocent woman, and attempting to destabilize the kingdom for your own gain. How do you plead?" Lord Aldrich opened his mouth to respond, but Helene cut him off. "Innocent." Her voice was steady, her ice-blue eyes fixed on Ren with undisguised hatred. "Everything I did for the good of this kingdom. That creature beside you is not your mate. She is an abomination, a servant who used dark arts to ensnare you, and if you had any sense left in that bewitched mind of yours, you would see the truth." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ren felt the weight of their stares, the judgment and curiosity pressing against her from all sides. But she didn't flinch. She had spent too long being invisible, too long letting other people define her worth. Not anymore. "You want proof that the bond is real?" Ren stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Then let me give it to you." She closed her eyes and reached inward, searching for her wolf. For days, the creature had been silent, buried so deep that Ren had almost given up hope of finding her again. But now, standing in the heart of the palace with Theron's warmth at her back and an entire kingdom watching, she refused to accept silence. She reached deeper, past the fear and the doubt and the years of believing she was worthless. And finally, she felt a flicker of response. Her wolf stirred, lifted its head, and for the first time in Ren's life, it answered her call. The shift took her by surprise. She had never managed a full transformation before, had always gotten stuck halfway, her body unable to complete what her spirit demanded. But this time was different. This time, she had something to fight for. Power surged through her veins, hot and electric, and she felt her bones begin to reshape, her muscles stretching, her skin rippling with silver-gray fur. When she opened her eyes, she was standing on 4 legs. The hall erupted into chaos. Nobles screamed and stumbled backward. Guards drew their swords, uncertain whether to attack or defend. But Theron's voice cut through the pandemonium like a blade. "Stand down! All of you! Stand down!" He moved to Ren's side, his hand coming to rest on her furred head. She was smaller than most wolves, lean and lithe rather than powerful, but she could feel the strength humming through her new form. Her wolf was awake at last, fully present, and when she turned her head to look at Theron, she felt the bond pulse between them like a living thing. "The mate bond cannot be faked," Theron declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "It cannot be created by witchcraft or deception. What you see before you is proof, undeniable proof, that Ren is my true mate. Her wolf recognizes mine, just as mine recognizes hers. There is no spell. There is no trick. There is only the truth." Ren shifted back, the transformation easier this time, and found herself standing beside Theron in her crimson gown, breathing hard, but unbroken. She turned to face Helene, and the hatred in the woman's eyes had been replaced by something far more satisfying: fear. "You lose," Ren said quietly. "You spent years making me feel like nothing, and in the end, you couldn't even take this from me. The bond is real. My wolf is real. And you are going to spend the rest of your life in a cell, knowing that a servant girl defeated you." Helene lunged against her chains, a scream of rage tearing from her throat, but the guards held her fast. Lord Aldrich and Lord Bowen stood pale and silent, their arrogance crumbling in the face of their failure. Theron took Ren's hand, lifting it high for the court to see. "This woman is my mate," he declared. "My queen, and anyone who threatens her threatens me. Let that be the last word on the matter." The hall erupted into cheers, and Ren felt tears streaming down her face. She had done it. After everything, she had finally found her voice, and she was never going to be silent again. The days following the trial passed in a blur of celebration and change. Helene and her conspirators were sentenced to life imprisonment in the northern fortresses, far from the palace they had tried to corrupt. The remaining council members, those who had stood against the plot or simply failed to participate, were dismissed and replaced with advisors Theron trusted. Della was promoted to Lady-in-Waiting, a position that made her blush and stammer every time someone used her new title. And Ren found herself at the center of it all, learning what it meant to be seen after a lifetime of shadows. It wasn't easy. There were still nobles who looked at her with suspicion, still whispers in corners she pretended not to hear. But for every cold glance, there were 3 warm ones. Servants who had once worked beside her stopped to curtsy and offer their congratulations. Guards who had ignored her for years now bowed their heads in respect. And everywhere she went, she felt Theron's presence beside her, steady and unwavering, a reminder that she was no longer alone. A week after the trial, he asked her to meet him in the gardens at sunset. Ren arrived to find the ancient oak tree transformed. Hundreds of candles hung from its branches, casting a warm golden glow across the grass below. Flowers had been woven through the bark, roses and lilies and sprigs of lavender, and a path of white petals led from the entrance to the stone bench where they had shared their first real conversation. Theron stood waiting for her, dressed in a simple black jacket with silver threading at the collar. He looked nervous, she realized with a start. The Alpha King, the most powerful man in 5 kingdoms, was actually nervous. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He took her hands, drawing her closer until they stood in the center of the candle-lit circle. His gray eyes searched her face, and she saw something in their depths that made her heart skip. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about everything that's happened, about how I found you and almost lost you again, about how close I came to letting fear and doubt destroy the best thing that ever happened to me. His grip tightened on her fingers. I promised to prove that you could trust me, and I intend to keep that promise. But I need you to know something first. He released her hands and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. When he opened it, Ren's breath caught in her throat. Inside was a ring, a delicate band of silver set with a stone the color of moonlight, surrounded by tiny diamonds that sparkled like stars. This belonged to my mother, Theron said. She was the only person in this palace who ever truly loved me when I was young. She died protecting me from my father's cruelty, and I swore I would never give her ring to anyone unless I was certain, absolutely certain, that they were worthy of her memory. He looked up at Ren, and she saw tears glistening in his eyes. You are worthy, Ren. You are kind and brave and stronger than anyone I have ever known. You saw me when I was lost and broken, and you chose to stay. You fought for us when I was too afraid to fight for myself. He dropped to one knee, the ring box open in his palm. I love you, he said. I have loved you since the moment you crashed into my chest and scattered bread across the floor. I will love you until my last breath and beyond, into whatever comes after. And I am asking you, begging you to be my wife, my queen, my partner in all things. His voice cracked. Please, Ren, will you marry me? She stared at him through a blur of tears, this man who had turned her world inside out and given her everything she never dared to dream of. A home, a family, a love that saw her for exactly who she was and wanted her anyway. Yes. The word tore out of her like a sob. Yes, Theron. Yes, I'll marry you. He surged to his feet and swept her into his arms, spinning her in a circle while laughter and tears tangled together in the candlelit air. When he finally set her down, he slid the ring onto her finger, and Ren watched the moonstone catch the light, shimmering with promise. I love you, she whispered. I love you so much it terrifies me. Good. He pressed his forehead to hers, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Then we can be terrified together. He kissed her beneath the ancient oak, surrounded by candlelight and flowers, and the soft hum of a world finally set right. And somewhere deep inside her, Ren's wolf lifted its head and howled with joy, the sound echoing through her soul like a song she had waited her whole life to hear. The wedding took place on the first day of spring, when the gardens were bursting with new blooms and the air smelled of possibility. Ren walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, her brown hair crowned with a circlet of silver and wildflowers, her mother's locket resting against her heart. It was the only thing she had left of her parents, and wearing it now felt like bringing them with her into this new chapter of her life. Theron waited for her at the altar, resplendent in black and silver, his storm-gray eyes bright with unshed tears. When she reached him and placed her hand in his, she felt the bond between them pulse with warmth, stronger than it had ever been. His wolf and hers, finally united, finally whole. I spent 8 years invisible, she said softly, her vows spilling out like water from a broken dam. I thought I would never be seen, never be wanted, never be loved. And then you crashed into my life and changed everything. You gave me a home when I had none. You gave me a voice when I had forgotten how to speak. You gave me a future I never dared to imagine. She squeezed his hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. I love you, Theron. I will love you for the rest of my days and beyond. His response was simple, spoken in a voice rough with emotion. You were never invisible, Ren. Not to me. I just didn't know how to see you yet. But now that I do, I will never look away. You are my heart, my soul, my home. And I will spend every moment of my life making sure you know how precious you are. The officiant pronounced them mated and married, and when Theron kissed her, the crowd erupted into cheers that shook the very walls of the palace. Della sobbed openly in the front row, clutching a handkerchief and beaming through her tears. Servants who had once worked beside Wren threw flowers at her feet, and for the first time in her life, Wren felt like she truly belonged. The months that followed were the happiest she had ever known. She learned to rule beside Theron, to navigate the politics of court with grace and wisdom. Her wolf grew stronger with each passing day, no longer the weak and silent creature it had once been, but a fierce and loyal companion that matched Theron's in every way. And when the winter snows began to fall, blanketing the kingdom in white, Wren discovered something that changed everything once more. She found Theron in his study, poring over reports from the border territories, and she didn't bother with preamble. "I'm pregnant." He looked up, his quill frozen mid-stroke. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, as if the words hadn't quite registered. Then his face broke into a smile so wide and bright that it transformed him completely, stripping away the king and leaving only the man. "You're certain?" His voice was barely a whisper. "The healer confirmed it this morning." She crossed the room and took his hands, pressing them to her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a pup, Theron. A family." He pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. She felt him shaking, felt the dampness of tears against her hair, and she smiled into his chest. "I love you," he murmured. "I love you both, more than I have words to say." Wren closed her eyes and let herself sink into his embrace, surrounded by warmth and love and the promise of a future she had never dared to dream of. She thought of the girl she had been, invisible, forgotten, scrubbing floors in the shadows of a palace that refused to see her. That girl felt like a stranger now, a ghost from another life. She was Wren, queen of the 5 kingdoms, mate to the Alpha King, mother to the heir who grew beneath her heart. She was loved, she was seen, and she was finally, irrevocably, home.